Okay, good morning to everyone. I hope this presentation will find you in a good health and in both mental and physical. And what I'm talking about today is, you see from my title, it's interpreting, reviewing, publishing, translation process inside King Fahd Qur'an printing complex. So what I would like to discuss in that presentation and why I think this topic is important. Of course, I will not reveal all the story behind King Fahd Qur'an complex. Everyone at least once or two times, even doing any of kind of research on the modern Islam, met with the translations published by King Fahd Qur'an printing complex, and not only translation, because everyone knows Mus'haf al-Madinatun Nabawiyya, the Quran Mus'haf printed in Medina is also widespread globally, and it's really hard to overestimate the importance of the issues published in that publishing factory. So my presentation is dedicated mostly to the institutional organizational efforts made by this complex in order to prepare, to review, and to publish the translations. How do they prepare the translations? How do they organize the review process? Are there any stages the translations goes through before appear in print? And have some of the controversial topics also rise inside this process. Why do this important for our project? I think is that because sometimes this organizational, institutional, maybe some kind of confessional approach, confessional agenda, is sometimes it determines the choices made by the translator. It's affixed not only the main text of the translation, that we call it matan here, but also it affects the commentaries, introduction, and what is more important, also the further fate of the translation. Because some translations appear and then they disappear, being printed just once or two times, and some new come. And some translation, they have a really good impact on the language they are translated into, and on the tradition they are represented in. So this is why I see some of the institutionals futures behind those translation really important for study those works and their further reception, and of course the influence that they have over some of the language, be it imperial language we make research on, or some like small languages spoken just a million or more people, but still important for the Muslim traditions there. So starting from that, my first general idea, the first general pattern is how the King Fahd Glorious Quran printing complex organized. I will just browse in a very brief note at the history behind it. The complex has been established in 1984, and there are a few departments inside, but the situation has changed somewhere before, 3 or 4 years before. Just in 1984 up to 2017, there were actually two parts in the complex. One is the government-owned facility, the General Directorate, and some other structures, and then private company, Saudi Ojer Ltd. It was operating all the complex, all the printing facility, technical staff, design, printing, everything related to the printing press has been in the hands of Saudi Ojer Ltd. And the company disappeared from the market in 2017, but actually it stopped the operation within the complex 2 years before. So the period of 2015 up to 2017, it was really hard for the complex, because just the Quran in the Arabic was printed, no new translations appeared, they were prepared, but there was some like a crisis time with a lack of lot of publishing and so on. There are also some political changes in Saudi Arabia, some plan for the economy and so on. So there are many other factors which influenced the complex at that time. But right now, the facility is government-owned and it's continuing its operation and doing every month, producing more and more both translations and Arabic versions of the Quran. Why is this important? I will show a little bit later why it was important, because the process inside was organized in a different style from the government, I mean general directorate facility, and for the private company inside. So first period of translation publishing, the first period appeared before the Center for Translations inside the complex was established. The Center for Translation was established in 1994, and the head of the center was Dr. Abdurrahim Fanyanabadi, and still he is in action. He is a director of the complex from the very beginning, from 1994. But just when the complex was established, there was a demand for translations published for different reasons, and the translations were first of all published with a special review. In that period, no new translations, actually completely new translations appeared. So the complex used existed translations, but making some commentaries inside, making some additions, and most of the things were edited are the vocabulary of translations, and also some of the verses related to the theological issues. New introductions were wrote, some of the commentaries were deleted, new written, and so on. So that was the time when some of the existing translations appeared, and mostly in the cooperation with Muslim World League. So the funding has come from there, and they started to print the Abdullah Yusuf Ali translation, well known, one of the first published by Complex, then the French by Mohammed Hamidullah, a well-known Kazakh translation, Albanian, and Bosnian. Besim Korkut, the translator into Bosnian, died before the translation appeared from King Fahd Quran Printing Complex, so they just made a small revision of it. But some of the, and of course for the Abdullah Yusuf Ali, the same story. But for Khalifa Altai, the translator coming from Kazakhstan, of Kazakh origin, originally he was from Eastern Turkestan, from present day China, and actually he came to the complex because he wrote some biographical treatises, some of his memories. He describes his state in the complex in the very beginning of 90s, when he was with a special commission, and they started to make a review, inviting translators, asking them some of the questions, like maybe making some exam of the knowledge of the Arabic language, knowledge of the target language, also inviting some reviewers. So Kazakh translation stand alone, but still it was published year before that. So it was the existing translation just published by the complex. So, but this is the first time of the complex operation, the first period, let it be called. And those translations or those editions, they are still of particular interest for us, because we see how differ them from the originally published. But what is also interesting, some of the translations appeared, like also for this Kazakh translation or the Bosnian translation, they appeared from King Fahd Quran Printing Complex in some revised edition, but they never had been printed in that edition later. So some of the Bosnian editions of Besim Korkut, they followed the first edition without any editorial notice from King Fahd Quran Printing Complex. So not all of the editions were well accepted in the countries they were dedicated for. Then in 1994, as I said, the Department for Translations, Markaz at-Tarjamat, was established in the complex. And what is also interesting to say, that it was the same year when Center for Quran Translation was established in Qum in Iran. So it seems to be that a kind of competition between the Saudi Arabia and Iran in promoting Quran translation, because they started to work very actively, and was Iranian complex also started to work in a very active way. And there were some commentaries from Shia scholars from Qum against King Fahd Quran Printing Complex, and the same stuff we can browse when looking at the articles appeared on Quran translation in Saudi press at that time, that there are some level of competition between both institutions. So now I'm preparing an article on the retranslations where I will mention some of those topics. They are in particular interest how the translation here goes along with some political process. And they established also a few units. The first unit is Asian language unit, then European languages unit, African language unit, encyclopedia productions unit, like they say, IT unit, and publishing unit. So those units worked before, and every unit had its own expert on Asian languages, African language, European language. But of course, I'm not sure that someone exists with the knowledge of actually all African or all Asian languages, but at least there were experts and with a good connection inside Saudi Arabia and was outside Saudi Arabia. And they mostly worked with students coming to Al-Jamia Al-Islamiyya bil Madinat al-Munawwara, so Medina Islamic University. Some students were coming from the areas. There are not so many scholars of Arabic from those countries, and they hired them like revisers for translations, not only translations of the Quran, but also some other work they published. So the same time, the main hub of reference, let it be said, or the main think tank for translation revising process was Medina Islamic University in that time. So they used it some students. Of course, one can ask whether the student qualified enough to make a review, but at least with a good knowledge of target language, they use it as one of the revisers for the future work. So since 1994, the department works, but right now they also made some changes in the internal structure. Only one unit, the European languages unit, is very active, and they don't have so many experts like before. We're working on the complex on many languages covering. So right now they reduced the human resource facility, mostly relying on the experts from outside Saudi Arabia and also from Medina Islamic University, King Saud University, Jamiatul Imam, Imam Muhammad Saud University, and other universities, Al Qura and other high school in Saudi Arabia. So there are some numbers produced. I made a count of, you see there are a note talking about Juz Amma, talking there because there are for some, we cannot count how many translations at all produced at King Fahd Quran complex, because we should divide between translations just printed. We should divide between translations only Juz Amma published in a popular edition. They have just a partial edition. Also, we should think whether this is a Latin one translation and two versions or not. So this is an example of Tamaziq language, the translation by Sheikh Muhammad Sihaj. He made it in this Larja Qabiliya and Kabila dialect of Amazic language. And it was published in Arabic script and also in Latin script. So this is one translation, but only two versions. But if generally talking about that, we see that translations were published in like every year, some new translation appeared, and the numbers I made like a conclusion from everything published by King Fahd Quran Printing Complex. Also, the website is quite informative sometimes. Yeah, so we can see that the number of translations still in rise, and even for last 20 years, they published a translation of more than 30 translations appeared. They are full translations, complete translations into some languages. So what I would like to talk about now, this is how the translations coming from the translator into printing press. So there is for example, there is a some translator working on a new translation, or sometimes King Fahd Quran Complex was looking for a translator to a particular language to produce, like they were looking for translator into German language, and translations of Frank Bubenheim appeared. They were looking also to for the translation into Russian language, into some other languages. they're different. Someone can ask, do they have a plan to cover their translations, or they just working on like in a tactical stuff? If someone appears, they use this possibility. They don't have a like global plan to make 100 translations in 10 years and so on. No, I don't think there is any plan behind. They just were operating on the basis there is someone. There is how many Muslims live in that country. Do they have some verified or trustworthy revisers for those translations? Do they have good connection? Is the Saudi embassy really working well in that country, and so on? So they were doing that in a very different basics. So this could be a part of particular research. Why do they publish translation into that language and not publishing into this language? Sometimes the work has been like into the Polish language, the work has been started by no news coming up to now, and some other languages also are in progress, but it takes too much time to appear for something in print. So there is an interaction between translator or copyright owners, if there is an existing translation. I will show the examples later, with a King Fahd complex directly, or via Saudi embassy, because Saudi embassies usually plays very active roles in establishing ties between translator and King Fahd Quran complex, or local Saudi-oriented Muslim organizations. I mean, Salafi organizations, or some of the Arab diaspora clubs, like it was a case for translation into Portuguese language, to Portuguese language. It appeared in Brazil with the help of the local Arab diaspora there. Then, when the idea is developed, there are some apply, which is should be written and directed to the Academic Council of King Fahd Quran Printing Complex. And after that, if they agree on that, that this translator has enough skills to promote translation, that his knowledge of language is good and his aqidah is correct. Yeah, this word in most of the documents which I will show from the King Fahd Quran Printing Complex, the notion of aqidah is especially important. They all the time ask, is that the one with correct aqidah? Can someone say something about that? And they also ask for the references to be written, that translator should be recommended by some trustworthy people. And of course, they need 2 references to have this translator approved. So when do they have those 2 references? They could agree that the referee could be someone from Saudi embassy, or that could be a local Muslim leader with Salafi orientation probably, or someone inside Saudi Arabia. There are different kinds of connection between translator and Muslim circles, so there's not a single pattern for it, but still they need some of those references. And they start to select revisers for the translator. How to select the revisers? Who can revise that? This one, they use the word muraja for a reviser, and there should be at least 2 revisers. They ask for the one who should be well fluent in a target language, a source language, and also the one with correct aqidah. But they don't need references for it. The translator can propose some of the revisers, and this is a quite frequent case when the translator proposes some revisers. And or King Fahd Quran complex can hire someone from Medina Islamic University and so on to make one more of it. As usual, there are 2 revisers, or sometimes there can be just one reviser. It depends on the language, depends on the complexity of the work, but I know the examples with 1 reviser or 2 revisers. As usual, most of them are mentioned in the formal introductions, complex attached to every translation, so we can see that there are such and such. Like we were discussing the translation into Spanish language, it was revised by Muslim scholars from Latin America, from Colombia, and from Bolivia. The local Muslims, one was also imam of some mosque in Colombia. So they were used like revisers for the translation into Spanish language, despite the translator was originally from Spain. So the King Fahd Qur'an complex recommended those translators in order to make, as they say, this translation more trustworthy. So then the final revision comes, approval and printing. I will talk more about that. And one moment. I just need to so then what is the final revision? Final revision for them is when translator is invited and he is coming to the King Fahd Qur'an printing complex. Usually they use that. Be it pre-existing translation or be it a new translations, if there is an opportunity and he can come to them, they organize a special commission from different scholars of tafsir and who asks him questions. And the list of the questions, I will also show how it works for them. And this committee can work from 2 weeks up to 1 month or even more. Every day for translator coming to this, like something like academic council, some kind of this lajna, and they ask him questions. How do you translate this? How do you translate that? Why do you translate it in this way, not in that way? They use also some dictionaries, they use some tafsirs. And recently, they started to promote Tafsir al-Muyassar as a main reference point, asking for why Tafsir al-Muyassar say this and that. And the best idea is to follow this. But I will show within a few slides how the list of those questions and the like ideological and intellectual data behind. So only then, when they approve this translation and translator makes necessary changes, they start the second revision. And the second revision is like a more technical stuff, but also for every translation, not only target text coming for revision, but also Arabic text. So for every translation, they revise it once and once again. That Arabic text should not contain, of course, any mistakes, and they are more careful sometimes to the design of the Arabic text than to the target text, because some of the translations published by King Fahd Qur'an complex, there could be some mistakes related to design. And they are very careful for that, of course, and this is why production of every translation, it takes years, actually. There are a very long time. Also, we see sometimes the difference on the covers of the translations published, a difference in data. Was it published in this year or another year? We see the ICBN used it for 1 year and another year appeared on the book cover. Why? Because there was a very long process behind for everything made for that. Only then they start the print, and even before that, they are sending some like compact disc for the translator who should sign it and send them back like a hard version to publish that there is a complete approval and he takes full responsibility for working on that. So there is a quite big process with a few stages, and I will go into some details of this process as well. What I would like to show now, for example, when they use the translation which is not prepared specifically for King Fahd Qur'an printing complex, there are some interesting changes. There is a Greek translation prepared, the translation into Greek language, prepared by the scholars from Al-Azhar University. As to my knowledge, there is the only case when they specifically state the translation is prepared by Al-Azhar, because there is, of course, some level of competitions between Saudi scholars, Egyptian scholars. There are a lot of connections, but still traditionally, and in some of the articles we can read that those are like Ash'ari oriented, they are Salafi oriented. But for the Greek translations, they just obtained copyright rules from one of the Greek philanthropes who requested and financed this translation before. So we see in the Greek version, we see, for example, 8 names of the scholars from Al-Azhar are mentioned well, but for the Arabic version, for the version published in King Fahd Qur'an printing complex, we see that Rajal min Qabl al-Mujamma, this one, and the translation has been prepared by Majmu min Ulama al-Azhar. So they are not mentioning their names at all, just Majmu Ulama al-Azhar, and that's all. But the revisor, who is Sheikh Jihad Bilal Khalil, the one who wrote PhD thesis in Riyadh on translation of the Quran into Greek and Balkan language. He's a well-known expert on translation into Greek and Balkan languages in Saudi Arabia, that his name is mentioned. So revisor is mentioned, but name of the translator is not mentioned, despite the scholars of Al-Azhar, they were just the revisers of them. Not all of them were enough qualified in Greek language, so they were more revisers of the translation. They were members of the committee, but the translator was this one, Nico Paraskeva. You see, he was the translator, but name is not mentioned at all here. So sometimes it happens. Maybe this is because of some agenda behind, maybe just because Jihad Bilal Khalil made a very deep revision of this translation. I may also show an example just for Surah Al-Fatiha, if comparing the translations with this one, even starting from Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, they made the changes. They did a philanthropo word used in the original Greek, completely another word is used in the translations by King Fahd Qur'an printing complex. The same we see from Maliki Yawmiddin, the one used Basilia, the one used Hegemona, and there was and so on. So I also compared Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Ma'idah. There are a lot of changes made by the revisor. This, if someone make research on the how King Fahd Qur'an printing complex makes changes in existing translations, preparing new editions, the Greek translations is a very good case, because Abdullah Yusuf Ali, they made some changes, but not so many. But for this case, there are really a very, very deep and insightful revision for that. The one worked with vocabulary. There was also in some surahs change of the syntax. I will not go into details because this maybe sometime in future someone will prepare a post on the Greek translation for us, but this is really a very good example of that. Now I want also to talk more about, I was talking about a new translation productions, because the Greek translation, of course, it was a translation, pre-existing translation published. This is like a finalization of the process I was talking about, that reviewer translation, translator first revision, then the committee, then the second revision by translator, then final approval, the design, and final proofreading. All the stages are necessary for making, for publishing the translation, and all of the published new period translations were promoted in this way. Now, how do they select the translator, and first of all, which translation requirement I used? Here I refer to the translation requirements. I decided to prepare them just in how to be written in the original Arabic without English translation, in order to be as much closer to the original as possible. And also I took this list from the contracts with translators, and also from the article published by head of translation department, Dr. Abdurrahim. He wrote it for the conference held in the King Fahd Qur'an printing complex 20 years ago. So first of all, the translation should avoid any mazhabiyya, ara ijtihadiyya, so it has to avoid any agenda. This is a general rule, but we can it's we can understand that process. So this is just short the requirement that one should follow the Quranic text apart from any ideology. Yeah, but of course it says nothing for us, because every translation has something from confessional style and so on. So then there is Wahdat al-Jamatul al-Faz al-Quraniya. This is the meaningful unity, the unity of vocabulary. This is mostly about the target text, and it's it's also quite natural. Then that there should not be any of additions or shortcomings in translation, and the one should avoid the literal translation. And this is a very good point that for all the titles they use tarjamat ma'ani al-Quran, so this is like a tarjama to tafsiriya. I'm not going to discuss the relation between tafsir and tarjama, it's a separate and hard topic, but still they have a notion of tarjamatul harfiyya, that the literal translation should be avoided. Then the very important point is working with tafassir, working with exegetical stuff, that the translator should follow aqwal al-rajiha, and in actually most of the contracts with translator, and this list of requirements, the translations, the tafsirs, they are mentioned by name. This is al-Tabari, al-Baghawi, Ibn Qasir, al-Sadi, and later they added also tafsir al-Muyassar. But there is a question, as we discussed it also many times, that Tabari and Ibn Qasir, they mention a lot of the opinions sometimes. And what about Aqwal al-Rajiha if al-Baghawi, for example, contradicts to al-Tabari, or Asadi contradicts to them all? There is a question, and there are a kind of flexibility in that. Even they promoted Tafsir al-Muyassar, they never say that you should follow it 100%, 100 to 100%. So the choice is up to the translator. And I think that working with this tafsirs, it opens some window of opportunities for the translator to make choices and not to be like predetermined by some exegetical tradition that I should do this and that. Even if we brought some of the translations published, like Hilali Khan and some others, they used not only those translations and commentaries, they used also Al-Qurtubi, they used some other tafsirs. When I was writing an article on some Central Asian translation, there are someone in translation into Tajik and Kyrgyz language, they were referring to Abu Hanifa legacy. And they were using some of the like Jalalain and other tafsirs, like Zamakhshari also, and so on. So this doesn't mean that he is reduces, but this is like the priority. So the committee asks it whether you can follow this or that, but the priority should be given to those tafsir. So this is just also very general rule, and we see that the final meaning production can be different even when translation use this and that methodology. Then this is about the vocabulary, that the words like salat, zakat, umrah, hajj must be transliterated rather than translated, but then exploited in the commentaries in order to make those translation with a very like a Muslim style. Of course, for the languages like Turkic, there is no problem to write a Hajj, Umrah, Zakat, or Namaz probably instead of Salat. They use that, but for the European languages, sometimes it can be problematic because it's make the style more Arabic or less Arabic, but they are very strict for that rule. And this is why I will repeat for Abdullah Yusuf Ali, they changed charity into zakat in their editions, because for them, even in the end of 80s, this for the methodology, they follow it very strictly, that this is mustalahat shara'iyya, the shariatic terms, they should be followed and translated very strictly. Also, we see that there is about confessional style, that some Islamic confessional style should be followed in target language. But also this is probably well fits with like languages like Turkish, Azerbaijani, Kyrgyz, Persian, or any other. But if talking about European translation, can the translation into German, Polish, Swedish, or Russian completely avoid Christian terminology? And what is Christian terminology? This is also a big issue. But this is why in almost all the translation, they use Ism al-Jalala, they use Allah, not God, God, Hoda, or any other word. So they prefer to use that one, starting from that point. They use also another methodology like for Rasul, for the Nabi, and so on. But still, some questions are there. Then we see that Nizam and Naql in the Kitabah, so there should be like the word order, and this rule is a little bit contradictory with the one talking about Tarjamatul Harfiya, but this is just a general, like a milestone, like a priority for the translator. Is it strictly or not? There's a question. Then this is something about the interpolation strategy or insertion strategy. We see that there should be some commentaries attached, and the commentary should be inserted by local same into the very text of the verse. So this is also quite understandable. And the last point is about usage of the modern language. This says not that the translator should avoid استخدام اللغة القديمة المرجورة, some archaic points and so on. So this is also the rule, but how do they check it? And which every language has probably different passive and active font of the language, different vocabularies, of course, used for translations. Even for the Greek language, do they use New Greek or do they use an Old Greek? There is a big question. So sometimes those rules, they also, I will repeat, they were used like a general pattern for translations, but still there are some flexibility appears in the final productions. So next point, what I would like to talk about, this is the typical evaluation from the revisor written about the translation. So this is a table used by the revisors inside Fahd Qur'an printing complex to evaluate not only translator, but also the translations. I'm not using here the names which language this is about for the reason of privacy, but this is a very general pattern. You see that someone writes about someone that he is Muslim in Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Minhaj al-Salaf al-Salih. This is well accepted, of course, the typical rhetoric popular in Saudi Arabia. And classification for mistakes, and those mistakes could be aqdiyya, related to the doctrine. There are mistakes could be related to the ahkam, so meaning some Islamic law, generally rules, rights, and that could be akhta lughawiyya. If there are a lot of akhta aqdiyya, the translation could be regarded as unsuccessful and all. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So if there are a lot of akhta aqdiyya, so the translation can be regarded as unsuccessful because, and there is one of the story from Sheikh al-Bulushi, one of the experts in the complex, who was writing about the Persian translations coming, that they tried to change the translation by Sheikh Waliullah Deghlavi into the translation by Mahdi Ilahi al-Qumushi, but they started to revise it and they have found a lot of mistakes, but mistakes lughawiyya, not mistakes aqadiyya. So mistakes were, as they say, errors were related to the language. So they say this is unsuccessful translation, so publishing, even despite the fact that the translation was prepared in a Shia context. So they criticized it with they report on the basis of just language strategies in translation. And we see also how do it, this is just a table with evaluation of translation. This is, we see uslub al-tarjama, that style of the translation. Wadih mahum, that this is applicable to all the people. or there could be, and the final, this is like a typical article review also in some journals, that final conclusion, Salih al-Nasha. So the Turjama is good. For this case, for this translation, we see that this is like a completely ready for publishing, just but ijra'at ta'dilat. So there are some changes should be made, and then the translation will appear. Yeah, but that could be Hayra Salih al-Nashr. The translation can be as well as unsuccessful at all by the opinion of the revisor, or at least one of them. This is what I would like also to show. This is the second stage of translation evaluation procedure, when the work with revisors is finished, when it's over, when translator is going to Saudi Arabia to King Fahd Qur'an complex, and works with special committee making revision of his translation. And they also have a list of the verses, and they have more than 200 verses. They are asking about how you translated it and that, how you translated it. I have a few lists received from the translations, from the translators. I'm not revealing here the names, of course, but this is a kind of this evaluation. So if there is a kind of mistake, they write that the commentary. We see, for example, about Surah Al-Fatiha, that there should be a commentary, Huwa Maghdubi alayhim and Huwa Dalin. And we see that many of the written translations published within 10 years by King Fahd Qur'an Printing Complex, they have at least some commentary over the last verse of Surah Al-Fatiha. So they try to avoid blaming Christians or Jews, as in some tafsir say that the one is about Jews and the one is about Christians, but they use a very general notions like Allazina tarakul haqq, yes, or just generally those who left the truth behind. And also this like a classical verse for classical marker for all the Salafi translations, Ar-Rahman al-Arsh istawa, or here we see another verse from Surah Al-Araf. What is istawa and ala wa irtifa is a well-known issue. Then someone translated stawa ila sama in a good manner, so they wrote just something like sahih. I just showed the example of the verses, how do they operate with it, but I have those lists. If someone is interested, I may share for further usage, just to know how do they proceed with every translation. And then we see that there are some of the verses, like from the Surah Al-Baqarah, that those verses, on their opinion, they need a tafsir, they need a commentary, that the translation cannot be produced without commentaries and all. And this raises also the question, why do some of the translation publish it with the commentaries, and why some of the translation publish it with complete lack of the commentaries? I reviewed Azeri translation in our GloQur post, and I reviewed Macedonian translation. There are complete lack of the commentaries, no single commentary attached. Why? For the some of the translations, there are very extensive commentary. Even for the translation into Russian by Kuliyev, the last maybe 100 pages is there are commentaries written on Hadith sources. So there are different strategies, but as I was told by Abdurrahim Fanianabadi, the head of Translation Center, most of the translations which produce it into European languages, the translation which are promoted as a resources for dawah, for the promotion of Islam, they need a commentaries. Like for the non-Muslim audiences, that the non-Muslim will have a lot of questions, that they will misunderstand something, and they need a commentaries. But for the translations published and for the Muslims themselves, into the languages predominantly spoken by Muslims, they don't need a lot of commentaries, and the commentaries could be avoided because there are a lot of tafsir literature existing and so on. But of course, cases are different, because there are some translation into African language with the commentaries, and translation into Central Asian languages with the commentaries. But there is a kind of general trend that like a translation for both Muslim and says not Muslims, they need a commentary, but like only Muslim translations, they don't need a lot of comments. So this is also kind of like a flexibility, but with some trend inside. There are another verses, I will not read them all, but there is also something that matlub tafsiruha, that it verse need a tafsir. Sometimes tafsir, and what is the point behind this tafsir? How do they select the verses which need tafsir and the verses which are not in need of tafsir? Like we see, for example, the verse from Surah An-Nisa. This is about Kasr as-Salat. This is about some Shariatic rules, or this is about some Asbab al-Nuzul. They also are promoting something like a context for that. There is a siyak context, and the translation should be produced within this context. But of course, it differs, and final choice is up to the translator. If the translator insists that this verse is completely clear for the audience, the opinion could be changed. For example, when there was a discussion in my own case for the verse Inna Allahu ma'ana, they said that you should add to your translation the verse that Inna Allahu ma'ana, it means that God is with us by his knowledge. So he is not with us physically. I said that God with us as is a well-known word or well-known phrase in many European languages. There are a lot of nobody will think that this is about physical presence. So there was a discussion over that because the language is different, and the experts working in King Fahd printing complex, they are mostly the conservative. The conservative ulama with strong Salafi affiliation, with relation upon their tafsir tradition and so on. So sometimes it's really hard to explain the difference between the language, and this is why they try to use this external reviewers because of the good knowledge of the target languages. There's also one of the points like Sibghatullah. Like Sibghatullah also needs a commentary that this is Dinullah wa Fitratul. If we will browse the commentaries on the left column, they are mostly taken from a Tafsir al-Muyassar. And they make a lot of efforts to make this tafsir more and more popular in recent times. Yeah, so there's also some other examples. And finally, talking about this Tafsir al-Muyassar, there are at least three translations recently appeared. There are translations appeared in 5 recent years. Almost all those 3 translations, they are no more than renditions of Tafsir al-Muyassar. We see the Tarjama Ma'ani al-Quran ila Lugat al-Tagalog. This is a translation into Tagalog, and this is a translation of Tafsir al-Muyassar. Also, there are Tarjuma Ma'ani Qur'an Karim Bazaboni Tajiki, the translation into Tajik language. This is also Tafsir al-Muyassar, translated into that language. And finally, this is Kiswahili or Swahili translation, also translation of Tafsir al-Muyassar. And Tafsir al-Muyassar also appeared in 4 editions, and in every edition of many languages as yes. Sorry. Can you hear me? Oh yeah, now it's I see there was some problems with connection. So I was talking about the Tafsir al-Muyassar, that almost in every edition of this tafsir, the introduction, there are 4 editions up to now, and in every edition they say that it must be translated into as many languages as possible. So there is a trend in the activity of King Fahd Quran Printing Complex to make a change of the translation of the Quran, or translation of the meanings of the Quran, into the translation of the tafsir. And I suppose this trend to be rather negative, because I see for the reception, the people or some of the Muslims or non-Muslims, they will continue to use mostly other translations instead of browsing something which is declared as translation of the tafsir, not the translation of the Quran, because like every tafsir, there is a strong ideological tension in it, and promoting tafsir is completely different point from promoting the translation itself. Of course, if this is a case of some European languages, but I will have special talk on Tafsir al-Muyassar, working hard now on it. So it is need another study. So making some conclusions, it will be really short because I will talk almost everything in the main part of my talk, that King Fahd Quran Printing Complex operates with its own translations from 1994, and despite some of the translation are really could be described as the Salafi one or the one following the Salafi mazhab, let it be said in this way. In reality, we see a lot of difference in translation. It depends not only on the target language, and it depends not only on some ideological contexts inside the countries the translations made into, but it depends also on the revisers, on the procedure, on the institutional side. How successful printing 1 or 3 times in the countries, or the translations just stand alone without any further attention from the Muslims in or non-Muslims in that country. So there are a lot of big differences and big of flexibility. Even the translation requirements, despite we can see that they are quite clear, they are not really of totalitarian. They they make a lot of freedom for the translator to make his choices for promoting his own vision of the Quran, and even appearing in from King Fahd Quran Printing Complex, we see that many translators then change something, prepare second or third edition of their translation. Almost all the translation appear after being published by King Fahd Quran Printing Complex. They also appeared as new editions with many changes. I see how do some of the translators change the verses related to the doctrine, to the theological issues. Some change the issues related to the law practices, some of the ritual practices, even names of the prophets and so on. The proper names they use, like the Christian names for them. And to if this is about the translation into European, and not only European, also Asian language as well. So this is why every translation should be, I think, the published by King Fahd Quran Printing Complex could be carried with like a big caution, that is it Salafi or not, and without the good analysis, just the fact translation is being printed by King Fahd Quran Printing Complex, it says in a very general way about the translation, that just very good in-depth analysis can show real differences between it. Even with Mike, now I started like the final point started to compare the Azeri translation to Azerbaijani language published by King Fahd Quran Complex, comparing it with some other translations into Azerbaijani language, it has a lot of common with translation published in Qum in Iran. Despite at the first glance, one can say it cannot be because there is strong Sunni Salafi tradition, there are Shia tradition, but we see a lot of common in style and in because of the similar translation requirements related to this, as I say, vocabulary, style, Shariatic terms, and so on. So this is why I think that my further studies on separate translation as well as the institutional side, those requirements and its promotion and application into the reality will show more about all those futures and their role in contemporary Muslim tradition. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. I hope everything was clear, and I'm ready to answer all of your questions, of course.